Okay, so what we're going to do in this video is we're going to go over how to make AI, how to make it randomly run around your level. And if you've got time, maybe if we shoot it, it will die as well, so we can kind of carry all that out. Now, if you haven't done so already, I would say go back and watch video 12, controller classes, in the playlist. It just kind of goes over one of the classes that we're going to use in the AI development, so just be aware of that. First thing that we're going to do is make a new folder. It's always a really good idea to house blueprints inside folders based on their kind of class or whatever they're going to do. I do have a character folder, but I'm just going to make an AI one as well, because not only are we going to be doing AI classes, oh, do I have an AI one? Oh, I'm just going to call this AI folder. Oh, I do. Oh, I have an AI one. Okay, it's got our target in, so I'm just going to use this folder. That's totally fine. So to create our AI, we're going to need a few classes. Okay, so the first one is blueprint class, and it's going to be a character. So this is a character as a type of pawn that includes the ability to walk around. That's exactly what we need. So let's create that, and this is going to be AI test. Let's go for that, and let's open another blueprint class. And this here one isn't actually in the common classes, it's down in this all classes part. It might be hidden, but if you click on that arrow, it'll open up, and we're going to just type in controller. And there's a few AI controllers that we can use. Okay, so there's the default one, which is just AI controller, and you can just see when you hover over, like, you know, it gives a description of what it is. An AI controller is a base class of controllers for AI controlled pawns. And then, like, controllers are non-physical actors, so they don't have any geometry or anything, but they're attached to a pawn to control its actions. So AI controllers manage the artificial intelligence for the pawns they control. In network games, they only exist on the server. We don't have to go into that. So these are kind of like non-physical things that you're not really going to see in the game, but they're actually going to control all the artificial intelligence within our enemy. Okay. So then we're going to go to AI controller and select that. Oh, there is another detour one. Okay. This is good if you're going to have a lot of enemies in your scene. And basically this detour crowd AI controller knows how to navigate around other AI. Okay, so it has that built in. It's a bit more intensive on the CPU, so just be aware of that. But for now, I think we'll be okay using the AI controller. Let's select that, and we'll just call this here. I'm trying not to use AI controller because by default that's already built into the engine. So I'm just going to call this test AI controller. And you can come up with a fairly unique name if you wanted to. So let's open up these. I'll get rid of those. There we go. Open up this one. There we are. So in the AI test, this is the character. So you can see that they're denoted by, this here is got like a small character. This has got like a pawn in it. So that's what the kind of like the thumbnail for an AI controller is. So in here, there's a few things that get inherited from the character class. So the capsule component is basically the collision for our AI. If you wanted to change the size of that, you don't use any of the tools up here. You come over to the details panel and use like capsule, half height, and radius and stuff like that. Let me bring that back to default. The next one is the arrow, and this here is basically just an arrow that points at whatever default way the character is going to be facing. So if we bring a mesh in now, which we are going to do, we're going to have to make sure that it's facing this way by default. So then this is the mesh, okay, and we do have a few skeleton meshes that we can bring in. Like, there's a few weapons, but we're not going to use those. The one that we want is the very bottom one, which is SK Mannequin Mobile. Okay, it's going to bring that in, and we're just going to move it down and rotate it so it is facing the right way. So we're going to have a T-posing enemy that's just going to walk around randomly, but that's okay. Capsule needs to kind of cover its head a bit more, so I'm going to make the half height a bit higher. Now I am going to make sure, maybe I make that a bit lower. I am going to make sure that his feet are near the bottom, okay, of this capsule, because otherwise he'll be floating around which doesn't really work out that well or look that well. So I'm going to make sure it's either just on it or just slightly below it. Okay, and that seems okay. So I've got, for my capsule component, just in case you're wondering, 95 should do. And then this here is kind of being moved down minus 90, okay? And the rotation is minus 90 as well. So there's some values that you can just input. So below that there is another inherited component. This is the character movement one. This houses all the variables and stats and attributes to kind of deal with how fast it's going to go, you know, how high you can jump, how much it's affected by gravity. Anything like that there is kind of housed in here. For now, I'm just going to leave those by default. I will, in a later video, show you how to change those if you wanted to add in like a sprint for your character or even your AI and things like that. But for now, we're just going to leave that as default. And that's basically it for a character. You think you would do a lot of scripting in here for a character base, but to be honest, that's going to be housed in our test AI controller and another type of asset that we're going to have to create, which is a behavior tree and a blackboard, okay? And there are two new things that we're going to introduce in this one. So this is what makes, I would say, AI a bit more difficult than anything else, because you're going to be using assets that you haven't really used before, and they kind of work with different concepts, so they do. So let's go back to our content browser, and we're going to right click in here. And oh, one last thing I forgot, in our character, okay, if we go to class defaults, there's going to be this section called Pong. And in here, it is basically where we're dictating what controller class is automatically going to, you know, attach itself to this. So you can see that auto-possess player is disabled, so it's never going to auto-possess a player. Auto-possess AI, it's only ever going to do that by default now if it's placed in the world, and this is really annoying, but if you spawn in AI, this AI, and you have everything working, it still wouldn't walk around unless you had place in world or spawned. Okay, so just make sure you change that. And then the next one is, what AI controller class is this character going to use by default? And we've got our test AI controller, so that's what we're going to use, okay? And then compile and save that. So that's all you really have to change in terms of like class defaults in here. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to blueprints. Oh no, it's not blueprints, it's artificial intelligence. And we're going to create these two nodes, okay, behavior tree and blackboard. Environment query, we're going to look into that next semester. It's like an additional thing that you can add into your AI for like cover and things like that. It's pretty powerful, pretty good, but it's more advanced, and we're going to leave that to next semester. So we're going to create a behavior tree, and I'm going to call this test tree. Yeah, no, let's go with that. And we're going to create a blackboard, and we're going to call this here test blackboard. I'm going to open up my test tree. I'm going to go through this first, and you can see that the blackboard's already kind of attached to it on the side anyway, so we can kind of go over to that. But basically a behavior tree is kind of what it says. It's a tree with branches, and each branch dictates a behavior within your AI. So the behavior might be, hey, look for a new random point in your level. And then another branch would say, okay, you've got a new random point. Let's move over to that random point. The reason we use a behavior tree and not blueprints, and you could use blueprints for this, but the reason that we don't is when you're doing AI and you're trying to think of logic that's pretty complicated, blueprints is really hard to use. So in a way, behavior trees kind of simplifies the process for you to develop AI, and it's far easier to debug and kind of manage, you know, maybe different attributes all at once. Now, it does use like variables and things like that there. You can see down here, like it's got a variable called self-actor. In actual fact, they don't actually call them variables in here, they call them keys, okay? And all the keys are stored in what's called a blackboard, okay? So the behavior tree basically goes, hey, I'm attached to a certain blackboard, and in that blackboard we've got a list of variables that we can use. Now, we need to tell it what blackboard to use, So if we click on here, you can see I've got test Blackboard. So that's what we're going to use. Sometimes that doesn't pop up and it's really annoying. So let me open up my Blackboard. Maybe I have to save that first. Let me try and do it. It's so annoying. I'm just going to close them down and then open them up. No, it's still not working. Let's see, what the hell is the issue? What's that? Let me go to my Blackboard. Oh, you know what I'll do? Maybe they need to be all saved, so I'm just going to save them all. Okay. And then I'll go in and try this. Still not working. Okay, let me open up my Blackboard. I think it is actually on it because I opened the Blackboard and it is opening up this behavior tree. So I think that is working. It's just not showing up here. We'll kind of maybe assume that it is here for whatever reason. Yeah, it's really annoying that that's not working for me at the minute. But basically over in your Blackboard is where you create all of your variables. So you can think of it as like my blueprint section within a blueprint, and you're just creating variables here, but to kind of store what's called a Blackboard. So this is kind of why people are like, oh, I hate, all right, I'm just getting used to blueprints, and now you're introducing Blackboards, behavior trees, and things like that. But to be honest, this is really the better way of using it. I could teach you how to use it through blueprints, but to be honest, then you know, if you're trying to go in the industry and they'd be like, well, why aren't you using behavior trees and stuff like that? So the first thing that we're going to do is, again, when we're creating functions in our behavior tree as well, they're called, what are they called again? They're called tasks. So they are. So again, like if you're creating a function, it's not called a function, it's called a new task. So just some of the terminology is different. The function doesn't actually reside within this behavior tree. You kind of save it as a new asset. And then any behavior tree, so if you've got multiple behavior trees, you can kind of use that function wherever you want. So think of a new task as like this global variable that can be used in multiple behavior tree blueprints. So if you create one, it means if you have 5 behavior trees, you can use that function or that new task in all these different behavior trees. So every behavior tree starts off with one root, okay, just like a tree, I suppose. And if you drag off from this root, you're going to have like a few options to choose. Let me get a selector and a sequence, and I'll kind of go through what the differences are in each. So basically a selector, if you hover over it, it kind of gives you a small description. It is a bit vague, but basically it is saying that this node will succeed if anything that's attached below it succeeds. And they call it children, okay? So you can see my root, okay, is attached to my sequence. So my sequence is actually a child of my root. If I drag my root onto my selector is now a child of the root, and then I can pull my selector onto my sequence, and my sequence is now a child of the selector. So the selector will succeed basically if the sequence succeeds, okay? And then we're going to have a few functions down here. The sequence only really succeeds if all the children down below it succeed, okay? So this selector could succeed if we've got like multiple sequences. You know, we could have like 4 or 5 or whatever, and then this will succeed. To be honest, it's a vague concept, but if we roll with it and we kind of demonstrate how it's used within Blackboard, or sorry, the behavior tree, then you'll start to kind of understand, okay? So the first thing that we're going to do is find or generate a function or a new task that is going to find a random location, okay? So the first thing I want to do is I want to go to my Blackboard, I want to make a new vector, okay? And I'm just going to call this here location. Save that. Can I still not do this? No, it's not letting me. We'll see what the crack is with that. Hopefully it is actually registering or Blackboard, and it's not going to fail, but I think it should be alright. So it should, hopefully. So you can see now in our behavior tree, it's pulling through our self actor and our location. And that means that we're going to create a new task, okay? So if I click up here Basically, we're going to create a function that finds a random location. That random location is going to be a vector. We're going to pass it through to this variable, and then we're going to tell this AI to move to whatever that location is. Okay, so going to create a new task. It's going to open up what looks like a blueprint, and it's going to call it BT task blueprint base underscore new. That's a terrible name, and you can see if I go out here to my assets, it's actually made it here. So what I typically do is I just go out straight away and just name it. So I'm going to call this random location. Okay, and you can see now that this here task or function is basically called random location. And it works exactly the same as a blueprint, only like it doesn't have components or anything like that. And we can make variables in here, so I'm going to go over that in a second. And there are no like event begin play or anything like that. This is a bit annoying. I'll kind of guide you through the process of how one of these functions work. So basically you have to have two kind of like event nodes, or one event and one return node for this to succeed. So the first one is called event receive execute. Okay, not execute AI, but event receive execute. So basically it needs this event to fire anything off. If you don't have this, it's not going to work. Okay, so the owner actor for this actually comes through the controller. So we haven't set this up, but basically what we're going to do later on is we're going to tell the controller to run this behavior tree. So whenever this function is called, the controller itself is going to be the owner. Okay, so what we can do is we can actually pull out from that there, and we could say like let's see, can I type in possessed or get AI controller? So I can get the AI controller that's coming from this. I can get let's see, what is it called? It's called pawn. Let's see, I can get the control pawn, not possess, the control pawn. So this is us getting the controller, okay, that's calling this function. This is us getting the actual character. It's called pawn in here, but it's the same thing. A character is inherited or a child of a pawn class. So we're getting the control pawn, you know, so it's probably going to be our AI character, you know, wherever that is. And from that there we can get actor location. Okay, and this is basically where we're going to have a starting point. You know, we want to find a random location, but we want to start from somewhere. Okay, so what we're going to do then is right click and type in get random, and it should pop up, get random point navigatable radius. Basically what it's going to do, this node is going to get a point within a navigatable radius, and I'm going to show you what a navigatable radius is later on, and it's going to return a random location. Perfect. It needs an origin, so I'm going to plug in my actor location as my origin, and it needs to know what radius outwards it should search for. Okay, so maybe I'll go, hey, I want you to search 50 meters, which is what, 5,000 centimeters. So I want you to search in this area. Okay, and then all we have to do from that is create a variable that's going to store this. And you might be thinking, okay, oh, let me call this random location. You might be going, oh, I'll just change this to a vector. But if you remember, Blackboard doesn't use normal variables, it uses keys. Okay, so what we actually have to change this type to is a Blackboard key selector. All right, so that's what we got to change to. So if it's a boolean, if it's a float, it's always going to be this. All right, and then what we do is we get a reference to this. We've got to make sure it's public as well. We get a reference to this, and we pull this out, and we go set Blackboard value as vector. It's really annoying. Okay, but basically what we're saying is, hey, we got this variable, okay, it's a Blackboard key, and we want to set a value in it, and the value in it is going to be a vector instead of just making a vector. No idea why they use this system. It's a very convoluted system, especially if you've been using blueprints, but this is what we got to do. So I'm going to make sure I connect up these execution pins before I move away. And the value that we want to set in here is going to be our return location. And then after that, we're going to have one final basically return node, and this is called finish execute. Okay, so we have to have that in order for this function to succeed. Remember, if we go back to our behavior tree, we need something in our child, when we call this to succeed, we have to make sure that we click success. Okay, so we have to have this at the end. And that's it. So that's the function that is going to get us a random location, okay, within our world. And then the next thing is we've got a built-in function already that will get our character to move to it. So if I go back to my behavior tree and pull out for my sequence and I type in random location, you can see it can get that task, okay? And let me compile and save this. And when I have this selected, it's saying, okay, you've got a random location Blackboard key in here. What do you want to set that as within our Blackboard? So we're going to say, hey, whenever we set a random location, that means the location in here is going to be the same, okay? So it's just going to transfer that information over to this one. And then, so once this succeeds, it's going to move along. There's nothing to move along to, okay? What we have to get is like a task that's already built in. It's called move to, okay? So this move to is pretty cool. It has a few things like acceptable radius. Maybe, it's not going to get exactly to the point that you've asked, but what is an acceptable radius, around that? Maybe I'll say like 100, so like 100 meters, or sorry, 1 meter. Or I could go like maybe 5 meters, totally fine. I could say, hey, I want, whatever you're controlling, you can strafe as well. That's totally fine. And the Blackboard key, this is basically what we're going to move to. I want you to move to a location, okay? And that's it, I think. Yeah, I think we just leave every other one, don't we? So this is basically it now. This should work when we attach this to our controller. It'll run this and it kind of move to a random location. The thing is, it will kind of just keep doing this. So what we're going to do is one last task. We're going to have a wait in here. We're going to just make it wait at this location whenever it arrives for like 5 seconds, okay? So if we go back to our task controller, what we're going to do is event begin play. We're going to run behavior tree, and we're going to select whatever behavior tree we've made. Mine is test tree, and that should be it. So we're going to go to our level now, and we're going to drag our AI in. Press play, it's not going to work. So if I press play, it's just going to stand still. And the reason for this is we don't have a navigation system kind of set up, okay, in Unreal yet. And it's pretty simple. Basically, it's a big volume, which dictates areas where the player can, or not the player, where the AI can walk or not. It basically makes paths for it automatically. So in the find or the place actor section, if we type in nav, we can get what's called a nav mesh bounds volume, okay, and bring that in. Now this volume, if I press P, it should bring it up. Let's see. P, yeah. So just make that big enough. So I press P, and basically what this is showing is the path that this volume is generating. So this volume basically looks at the geometry that you have within your scene, and it creates this kind of 3D path, okay, layer on the top of it. It's invisible, but if you press P, it shows it up. So if we expand this box out, you can see that it builds a path, and wherever you see this green is basically where your AI can walk, okay? So just make sure that, it's probably big enough and covering a good part of your level. Otherwise, your AI might kind of get lost and not be able to go somewhere. And that's it. So all you have to do now is press play, and we should see our AI wandering around randomly in some locations. So it might wait there for 5 seconds then, and then go to a new location. Again, the location is based off of that function where it's just randomly finding something. So it's not actually going to a targeted location or anything like that. There's very, very little artificial intelligence going on at the minute. Okay, so that's the first part. That's the part where we have got our character randomly going around. In the next video, what I'm going to do is just show you how to have a AI, when it sees the player, it's actually going to start walking towards the player. Okay.